So let me think. The conversation here today, or what we're going to talk about today, is difficult conversations, and not awkward conversations. So if you thought you were coming here to learn how to not have awkward conversations, then you're in the wrong place. I mean, they're quite different from each other. I mean, awkward conversations are things where you just feel like it's just like a weird conversation. You feel like it's like the conversations you just had a half an hour ago and the conversations you're going to have in like an hour. Those are just conversations that are just kind of weird. You might be with somebody who's like kind of weird and you don't really get along, or you're not really sure what to say. That's not what we're here to talk about today. Those are fairly easy and straightforward to deal with. You just need to think about what the other person finds meaningful and talk to them about that. What we're going to talk about is a much more complex and complicated problem, which is to have very difficult conversations at work. And I'm going to start by talking about a couple of difficult conversations I had over the last week, 2 weeks. I'm a professional difficult conversationalist. As a rule, I try to approach my problems as proactively as I can, and so I end up having these difficult conversations on a fairly seemingly regular basis. And actually, it was interesting that even just the idea of putting together this talk and thinking about this talk has actually helped me to think about how I deal with difficult conversations and what's involved in that process. And so I thought it'd be useful to maybe think about, because I just had a really difficult one, and maybe try to decompose some of that in terms of what basically the science, or certainly the science of psychology and negotiation, tells us about how we deal with difficult interpersonal issues. And it started last week, about 2 weeks ago. I've been running a consulting firm for about 10 years. And recently I took on a business partner. And so we have decided we're going to be partners to try to make the world a better place. That's at least what we're telling ourselves. And we're new in this relationship. I mean, we're friends, but the business relationship is new. And one of our clients, our biggest client, I have a personal relationship with the CEO of one of these investment banks. And in the process of sort of emailing back and forth about the project that we're doing with them, I sent an email that really said a whole bunch of reasonably accurate information, but I said "I" every time that I was referring to what we'd come up with, what we were thinking, and what we were going to do with them. And I said, I scheduled a meeting with the committee. I did this. I did that. And I got an email from my business partner, and he said, I'm really confused by this email, and it makes me question, I feel like you're bringing ego into the equation, and I thought we were partners. I thought this was something that was going to happen. I said, you're misreading the situation. He emails me, I email him back, and I'm like, you're totally misreading this. You're the one who's bringing ego into this situation because you think that this is a threat to you, and I'm just trying to negotiate the relationship with this person. And we had actually had a conversation before about me building that relationship more personally as well. And it sort of escalated from there, and I was like, oh my God, I've got a very difficult conversation I need to have with this person, where all of a sudden we're at the beginning of a journey together, and we're already in the position where we're now sort of at loggerheads, and this is a situation where we're in a personal relationship, we're friends with each other, we're in a business relationship, and there's now this pretty significant misunderstanding between us, and trying to figure out how to approach that conversation, because I knew we were going to have it on Saturday, and I was not looking forward to it. I just did not want to. I did not want to go through this experience, and I knew it was going to be difficult. And so I thought about what was involved in the conversation that we were going to have. And that's sort of what I framed the talk around today. It's sort of the elements of the conversation that make up what is really a difficult conversation, and how thinking about those different elements of the conversation helped me to try to think about how I was going to approach this in a way that was going to lead to a productive outcome, and how confusing it can be when you end up in a conversation with somebody that's not going very well, or you end up in a dispute with somebody where you're not sure how you got there. So with that, let's talk about what are some of the fundamental elements of a difficult conversation. And I'd say that there are really three. You had me practice the click and it didn't work. I was making fun of her. I was like, oh my God, I sprained my finger. But no, it didn't work. All right, there we go. It worked. All right. So there are three, in any difficult conversation that you're going to have with somebody, conversation that you don't want to have, a conversation that makes you feel uncomfortable, a conversation where there's something at stake or where the outcomes are somehow important to you or the other person, there are facts. There are the things that happened that led you to that conversation. There are the feelings and emotions that you experience as part of that conversation, or that you experience going into that conversation and out of the conversation. There are the feelings that the other person experiences about the issue, about whatever you need to discuss, and during the conversation. And there are identities that are at stake. How you think about yourself, what you feel about yourself, that are at stake and that are at issue in the conversation, both for yourself and for the other person. And so we need to think about, when we're going to have a difficult conversation, how we're going to approach each of these elements, each of these components. And it's not altogether clear how you would do so. Let's start with the first one, facts. That ought to be pretty easy, right? Something happened that led you to the point where you're in this conversation. But facts are a tricky thing. Facts are a slippery subject. What happened in this conversation, or that got me to this conversation with my business partner? Well, I wrote this email, right? I wrote an email, and I wrote it for a particular reason. And those are facts. There were things I said in that email. There are reasons that I said those things. But why? But his interpretation of those facts may be very different from mine, and that's exactly what happens in many of the difficult conversations we end up with. Somebody needs to give you some difficult feedback, or you need to give them some difficult feedback. The thing that led you to giving that feedback, the behavior that they engaged in or that you engaged in, is up for debate. And it's up for debate for a number of reasons. The main reason is we just see the world differently. We all see the world through our own eyes and through our own lenses, and we tell ourselves a story that makes sense to us as being the one true story, that I wrote that email and I did it because I was trying to manage that relationship with our client. But that's not necessarily the same thing that somebody else is going to see. So we have what's called perceptual biases. Perceptual biases are the way that we perceive the world. And the way that we perceive the world is very different for each one of us. And I'll show some examples of how that works and the consequences that has in terms of the way that we approach the conversations that we have. We also have attributional biases. So we have differences in terms of why things happen. And we have biases that influence how we perceive why things happen to us and why things happen to other people, or why I did things and why somebody else did something. There's biases in terms of how we recall information, how we think about how likely things are, what happened in the past. There are biases in terms of how we treat evidence for our positions and what might be going on in that conversation. And then there are biases about how other people think about us. And all of these biases make it really difficult to have an objective conversation about facts, because we're likely to walk into any difficult conversation with a different understanding of reality. And so one of the key problems that occur when people end up in a negotiation or end up in a fight or end up in a difficult conversation, a dispute, is that they have a fundamental different understanding of just what happened. Before we even get into feelings, before we even get into the threats to identity, just figuring out what happened can be really tricky. And so your perception of the world is based on your experience and it's based on your expectations, really. And your expectations are based on your experiences and your personality, right? The things that you are prone to look for, the things that are highlighted in your vision, the things that you've experienced before. things that you're expecting to see. And it turns out we are very different in terms of our previous experiences and our personalities and what we expect to see in the world. And so the things that we pay attention to are different from the things that other people pay attention to. And you're only capturing a tiny piece of the information that actually exists in this world, obviously, a tiny, minuscule piece. And what you remember is small as well. Of that bit that you even look at, that you even observe and perceive, you only remember a tiny piece of that which is important to you. And so other people are going to remember things totally differently. They're going to perceive parts of the world and things that happened that you're not going to see. You have a significant experience with a alcoholic parent. You're going to notice very clearly controlling behaviors in a boss that aren't, or erratic behaviors in a boss that somebody who doesn't have that same experience aren't going to notice. And then when you have a complaint, it's not going to be perceived the same way by somebody else or by that boss themselves. So we pay attention to very different pieces of information. And so our belief in our objective experience of the facts makes it very difficult to have a conversation about something that's challenging to both parties. Because if you start by just talking about what happened, you might start from very different understandings of that very simple process of thinking about what happened. So starting with that, okay, so we suck at figuring out just, realizing that the world is full of information that we're not necessarily sharing with other people, that we don't have all the same information. And so we tend to go into difficult conversations believing incorrectly that we share the same perspective about what happened. And so we often get confused and challenged but when people contradict our interpretation of events, just the events themselves. Now the events, facts, that's only part of the story, right? Because what happened is often much less important than why it happened, than why you did what you did. Why did I write the email that I write? Why did he respond the way that he responded? In our legal system, we care a lot about intention, right? When we think about somebody, you drive and you hit somebody in your car, or you kill somebody by mistake, it's manslaughter, right? You kill somebody on purpose, and it's murder. And those have very different legal ramifications because we care about intentions. Intentions matter a lot. And attribution biases are really difficult because what they do is they make it very difficult for us to understand other people's intentions. So you have all these people on the train saying, look at these people, glassy-eyed automatons going about their days, never stopping to look around and think, I am the only conscious human in a world of sheep, right? All of them seeing themselves as free actors, as conscious thinkers, and everybody else's intention is simply to follow the pack and act in their own self-interest or act as an automaton, right? So this is how we work as human beings. We have what are called self-serving attributional biases, where we see ourselves as being free-thinking, pro-social individuals, and we tend to see other people as being self-centered, irrational, egotistical, and so forth. And so we tend to interpret our behaviors quite different than other people's. And one of the reasons why is we know why we did things, right? And we have a significant motivation to justify those things to ourselves as having a moral or rational basis. So we understand ourselves and we engage in a sort of self-serving attribution about what we did, and self-serving attribution about a self-serving attribution about why other people engage in the behaviors they engage in. And beyond that, we make what's called the fundamental attribution error, which is that we tend to attribute our own successes and the things that happen to us as being caused by dispositional personal factors. But we tend to attribute the failures of other people to dispositional factors. We tend to fail to consider the situation that might have led to their behaviors in the first place. So if somebody else falls over, we tend to think that they're clumsy, right? If we fall over, we tend to think of ourselves as being, oh my God, that step was broken. That was, obviously I was tired, things. We come up with all kinds of situational explanations, attributions, for why the behavior happened that don't relate to our personality or our stable traits. In contrast, when other people screw up, we say, it's because of something about them. They have got an, egotistical problem, and that, in fact, that's exactly what my business partner sort of implied when we had a conversation. He said, I think maybe you've got too much ego invested in yourself, and that you want to. You can't separate the business from your own grandiose beliefs about who you are and what you deserve. And I said, this doesn't feel right, but I can see how you would think that because that's how we all think about each other. And so, these attribution biases are really dangerous because it makes us tend to overestimate the likelihood that when somebody has done something wrong to us, or somebody has done something that we don't like, or so there's a difficult conversation that we have, that we tend to attribute malign intent to those things and stable factors that can't necessarily be changed. And so it's our job to sort of tell them how to be a better person, rather than our job to try and figure out what might have gone wrong or what might have happened in their situation that might have led to those behaviors themselves. And so these attributional biases are tricky. And when you get into a difficult conversation, one of the things you really need to uncover is why the other person did what they did. So if somebody comes in late to work every day, and you need to tell them about, it's not okay to come in late every day. The assumption shouldn't be, although it often is, this person doesn't care. That's why they come to work late every day. Or they're irresponsible, or they're not very conscientious. But what if they have a child who needs to get to work? Or they have some other situational contingency that makes it very difficult for them to get to work on time. And it's important to understand those behaviors before having a conversation, because the reason why is going to determine the scope of that or the direction of that conversation itself. We also struggle to think about so we also struggle in other ways. Let me ask you a quick question. So, rank order the following causes of death in the United States between 1990 and 2000, placing a 1 next to the most common cause, 2 next to the second most common cause. So just tell me how many people think that tobacco is 1 or 2 in terms of causes of death? How many people think poor diet and physical activity are? You raise your hand. How many people think motor vehicle accidents is number 1 or number 2? How many people think firearms is number 1 or number 2? Yeah. 10%. How many think illicit drug use is about number 1 or number 2? All right. So I would say about 30% to 40% of people thought that motor vehicles, firearms, and illicit drugs might be number 1 or number 2. And they're not. It's actually in the right order. And not only is it in the right order, let me show you how much it's in the right order. The difference between tobacco and poor diet, right? We're talking about 10 times more deaths than the third highest. That there is substantial, not just a little bit more, substantially more. But why do you think it is that we think that motor vehicles or firearms might be the most common cause, one of the most common causes of death in America, even though it's less than a tenth of how common of a cause for death? Why do you think that is? You hear about it, right? It's easy to think of examples of it. It's easy to think of examples of times when you hear about somebody dying of a gunshot. It's not that easy to think of examples of somebody dying because they're really overweight, even though it happens all the time, right? We just don't think about those examples because they don't come to mind that easily, because the media doesn't spend a lot of time paying attention to those examples. And so what it turns out is that things that come to our mind very easily, things that we can process or think about or remember very easily, we tend to think are much more common than they actually are. And we tend to think of them as being much more true than they actually are. So, for example, there's this great study where they gave people an argument to read about a cause, like why we should have renewable resources, why we should invest in renewable resources. And they gave one group it on a sheet of paper with it very clearly written, right? Very, exactly the same words on both sheets of paper, but on one, it's like a very good copy. And on the other, it was like a really bad copy. So the copy came out of the printer, and it's like a little smudged and like a little harder to read. And then they asked people, how true is this statement? And people who read the clear copy found it to be much more true, right? why would they think it's more true? It's the same words, right? It's the same argument. Because it's easier to process, because it's easier to read. And when something's easier to read and easier to process, we're like, oh, that feels like it must be true. Right? So we think about these things that happen to us, and we're like, okay, so what are the things that are easy to process when you're going into a difficult conversation? Well, it's really easy to process the things that happen to you that you know about, right? It's really easy to think about, for example, you're working on a team, and you need to talk to one of your team members about not contributing enough, right? And you're like, oh, God, we've got to have a difficult conversation about this, but they're clearly not contributing enough. Because, I stay up late all the time. I'm always working really hard on this project. I'm always thinking about it when I'm going to work, and I'm always thinking about this project, I'm always working on it. I am contributing all the time, right? They're not. Because it's very hard for me to think about times that they were actually doing those things. So they must not be doing that very often. And so what we end up with is vastly different interpretations of how much people are contributing. And in fact, when you look at a team of people and you ask everybody to rate how much they've contributed and how much everybody else on the team has contributed, and then you add up everybody on that team's percentage of contribution, you always end up with more than 100%, always, right? Because people are like, I must be contributing more because I can remember all these times that I've been contributing, that I stayed up late, that I worked hard. And I can't think of those times very well for you because I wasn't there. I wasn't there when you were thinking about them. I wasn't there when you were staying up late. And so it's actually really difficult for us to put ourselves in the shoes of somebody else and say, okay, how do you see what's happened in the past? Not just why did you do things, but really the events that led to the situation that we're in now. And so when you have a conversation, you need to be aware that, I guess, and again, the point of all of this is that when you have a conversation, you have to be aware that you're not going to see the world the same way. And so you've got to think about a difficult conversation is not an opportunity for you to go in there and tell somebody about what you think and about what happened, but to learn from them about what they think happened and why it happened. Similarly, when we search for information that justifies how we feel about, why we need to have this difficult conversation with this person, we're not exactly equal judges when we do that. We don't think like judges when we evaluate information. We think like lawyers. We don't take information and say, okay, well, all the evidence says this and some of the evidence says this, and I'm going to weigh that up and see which one makes the most sense. No. What we do is we come to a conclusion that is generally self-serving, and then we look for evidence that confirms that, and we discount evidence that disconfirms that. So we tend to pay much more attention to things that confirm what we already believe, and we pay much less attention to things that disconfirm that. And this has been shown in lots of studies, over and over again, that once you get somebody, even you don't even have to really believe it. You just have to be presented with that information first. And the first thing you're presented with ends up having a huge impact on what your final beliefs about that thing are, because all other information is then filtered through you trying to confirm that initial piece of information. And so we act in a biased way when we try to construct arguments but it doesn't feel like that. It feels like you're being fair. It feels like you're being as close to fair as possible in terms of figuring out what's happened. And so the confirmation bias kicks in, and again, the same thing's happening for the other person the whole time, right? They have all the same biases, and they are coming to all the same sorts of conclusions because they have a self-serving bias, they have a confirmation bias, they have other sorts of attributional biases that are leading them down the same garden path. And finally, we have biases in how other people think about us, right? We tend to think other people are spending a lot of time thinking about us. And it turns out they're not at all. They're and when they are thinking about us, they're not thinking about us in like a lot of detail. They're thinking about us in very, very broad brushes, very broad thoughts. So when you look at yourself and you try to judge, whether somebody is going to think you're attractive, you look in the mirror and you're like, oh man, my hair looks different. It didn't look like that yesterday, and my eyes are kind of baggy, and all these things that you judge about yourself about how attractive you're going to look to other people. And it turns out that's not how people make judgments about you at all. about your attractiveness. They make very broad judgments because they don't remember what your hair looked like 2 days ago or last month. They don't remember what your face looked like back then. They just know sort of, are you well put together? Like, are you tall enough? Like, just sort of very general features. And so we are highly inaccurate about judging how other people judge us in terms of our behaviors, in terms of our personalities, in terms of our attractiveness, because we focus on the fine-grained details and they focus on the larger features. And the same thing happens for them. And so we may have a very incorrect idea about how much somebody has analyzed our own behavior, right? And how closely they've been looking at what we've been doing. Because they're thinking about themselves. They're not thinking about you, just like you're not thinking about them. You're thinking about yourself. And so we tend to think somebody else will have the same level of detailed understanding of ourselves, our behaviors, and our motivations that we have of ourselves. And that's not true either. I just thought this was funny. So what can you do? Just about this first thing. And let me check time. It's fine. It's definitely time. So what can you do? Well, there's a couple of things you can do. And I like to say that, to start with, think about difficult conversations not as being about what's true, because you're not going to get there. It's impossible to find out what's true. All you can hope for is to understand more about how you perceive the situation and how they perceive the situation. To start off with, that's the best you can hope for, is to think about what it is that they think and what assumptions do you take into that conversation. So it's really an opportunity, a difficult conversation. And when I was thinking about, how was I going to start this conversation, was it about me telling him about the email that I wrote and why I wrote the email, or was it about trying to figure out what his interpretation of that is, or why he interpreted the way that he did, and why he interpreted previous behaviors possibly in a similar way. So the difficult conversation at first is an opportunity to test some assumptions that you might have about the other person, to learn from them. The second is to give people the benefit of the doubt when it comes to intention. That generally, it turns out that people have reasonably good intentions most of the time. That if you really ask, why did you do that, which is a question that does not get asked nearly enough. Usually the question we're asking is, what did you do? Not why did you do it. We ask, when did you do it? When did you call me? Why did you, but we don't ask the question of why. And the question of why is the most important one to know. And giving people the benefit of the doubt. And knowing to some degree that people aren't necessarily, just like you're not necessarily fully aware of why you do things before you do them. It may take a little while. People may be inconsistent to some degree, at least to start off with, about the motivations for their behavior. And so one of the things you need to do for yourself is to interrogate those questions before you go into that conversation. Why did you act the way that you did? Why are you feeling the way that you are? Why do you think things happen the way that they did? Another one is thinking about getting some perspective, right? Everybody talks about perspective taking, right? Perspective taking is being an important aspect of trying to work through problems. But there's some interesting research on that suggests that just trying to put yourself in somebody else's shoes is actually not that useful. And it doesn't really work that well, because how do you do that? I'm not you. I can't figure out how you see things. I haven't had your experiences. I don't have your personality. And so how can I possibly really put myself in your shoes? I can try to empathize with your situation, but it's kind of hard to really have true perspective taking. So what kind of perspective can you take that would be useful to get a more accurate perception, at least, of maybe what's going on and maybe how you see it and maybe how you see me and my behaviors? And there's some interesting research by this guy Epley from University of Chicago. They wrote a paper in Psych Science a couple years ago called how to be a mind reader, I think it was called, or something like that. And what they showed was that if you ask people, so there's they did a study and they brought people in and they said, okay, we're going to take a picture of you, and we're going to give this to another group of people to rate how attractive you are. Now, how attractive do you think they're going to rate you? And they actually had another group of people who they gave that picture to, and they rated that person to see how attractive they were. And there were two conditions. In one condition, they said, we're going to give this picture to people today, or we're going to give this picture to people in 2 months. And it turns out when they gave the picture to they said we're going to give when they told the people they're going to give the picture to people that day, people were really inaccurate about judging how attractive the other people were going to think they were. But when they said we're going to give it to you in 2 months, these people in 2 months to rate their attractiveness, they still gave it to them that day. But they said we're going to give this to people in 2 months. People were much more accurate in assessing how people were going to view their attractiveness, because by thinking about this like future situation, you start to match the construal level of the people who are actually going to be rating you, which is from a step back, not today when you were in the mirror and you were looking at how you looked and thinking about that, but in 2 months, you're not going to care about how you look today, right? So you take a step back and be like, how would I view myself in 2 months? It turns out you view yourself sort of from a step back, and it turns out you're more accurate in terms of your ability to assess yourself. So I would suggest that this is actually a way to think about conversations and issues that you have, is say, okay, how would I evaluate this issue in a year or in 6 months from now? If I had to think about what this conversation's about and what went wrong. Not if I had to tell somebody about it today, but if I had to have this conversation in 6 months from now or 2 months from now, what would I tell them about this conversation, right? Then all of a sudden, it removes you a little bit personally from the situation. It removes you from the construal level of being in it to being outside of it and saying, okay, well, what's really important? And that's exactly what we try to do. We try to get some distance, some perspective. Perspective just means moving back from something so that you can see it for what it is. And in fact, that's exactly when you go to a couples counselor, right? The whole reason we go to a couples counselor when you have a romantic partner is because that person has perspective. They just like, they can step back. They're not in it, so they can see what's going on between both people in a way that makes sense to everyone, because they're not so fully invested in it that it's impossible to get that perspective. So I would say use that. That might be a little trick. Is just try to match the construal level of the other person in that situation. Third, and this is something I'll come back to a couple of times, is rather than focusing on facts, focus on interests. That the facts themselves are not that important, right? What happened is less important than what do we need to accomplish here? What are our goals? What's the purpose of having this conversation? Okay. So the first step is to deal with facts. Facts are tricky. Facts are tough because truth is very slippery. And we're going to have very different interpretations of the things that happen. Not only are we going to have different interpretations of the things that happen, but we're going to have different feelings. And those feelings are going to drive how we think about the situation and how we can reach a resolution to whatever issue we're drawing. If you feel a sense of anger, it's going to change the way you think. How is it going to change the way you think? Well, it's going to change the way you think in a number of different ways. If you feel hurt, if you feel ashamed, if you feel negative emotions or positive emotions, it influences the way that you think. And here's a couple of ways. One, there's something called mood congruent memories, which means that memory retrieval. So what it means is that when you're experiencing a particular emotion, it's much easier to retrieve memories that are consistent with that emotion. So it turns out the way our brain works is that our emotions, our memories are like sort of emotionally tagged. They get tagged with an emotional sort of ding, and then when you experience that emotion, it highlights the nodes in your brain that are attached to that feeling and those memories. And so it makes those things much more accessible, much easier to think about, much easier to remember. And so when you feel hurt, it's much easier to think about times that this person has hurt you in the past, or other people have hurt you in the past. And remember, the easier it is to think about something, the more common you think it is, right? So you end up with this weird ease of recall bias where you're like, this person, they screw me over all the time, right? Because it's really easy for me to think of a couple of examples when that happened. So your emotions guide your thinking, and then the way you think then reinforces how you feel, right? Because it can exacerbate the way you're feeling about a situation. It also influences the way that we think. So when we're having strong emotions, it can, especially negative emotions, it can severely constrain our thinking, right? It makes us less likely, much less able to be persuaded, makes us more critical, but it also just makes us less creative. Because negative emotions make you think in a more narrow, focused way. And they do that for a very specific reason, that we use negative emotions, or we use negative emotions from an evolutionary perspective. We use negative emotions to have very specific actions. So, for example, if you see a tiger running through hiding in the bushes, you experience fear. That fear stimulates the desire to get away, and that makes you run very quickly. So when you're afraid, you don't tend to think about a whole lot of things except escape. If somebody's attacking you, you experience anger. Anger promotes the action to confront or to fight, and it's very hard to think about other things when you're experiencing that sort of emotion. And so negative emotions promote action. They don't promote creative problem solving. And difficult conversations are problems that need to be solved. That is all they are. They are just a problem that you need to solve, and you probably need to have some creativity to solve it, and you need to collaborate to solve it. And so thinking about a difficult conversation as a collaborative problem-solving exercise is the mindset you need, and that's interfered with by having strong negative emotions. Now, does that mean you can leave the emotions at the door? Absolutely not. Because guess what? You don't get to choose. You don't get to choose how you feel. You just feel how you feel. And it turns out trying to suppress how you feel is not an effective way of getting around that. In fact, the research is very clear that when people are told, don't feel anger, try not to feel anger, try not to feel fear, try not to feel hurt, that has no effect on their ability to have positive social interactions or actually just their mood in general. So they don't go away, they just manifest as judgments and attributions, right? So you're angry, you try to suppress that anger, well, it just comes out as justification. Okay, well, I feel angry for a reason, it must be because you did this to me, right? Because you are to blame for the way that I feel, right? Because we want to justify our feelings, especially our negative emotions, which we have trouble sometimes talking about or dealing with. In addition, these negative emotions have, they take a fast route. They tend to, things that are threatening get first priority in our mind. And so ways of solving a problem constructively, creatively, learning about somebody else's perspective and issues gets interfered with by these negative emotions. So we need to figure out a way to deal with our emotions in a way that's positive, that's constructive, but also recognizes the fact that they're inescapable. That not only are you experiencing these emotions, they're experiencing these emotions as well, especially when you start having a difficult conversation that brings emotions to the surface if something really truly is at stake. So what can you do? Well, part of it is about being emotionally aware, right? Trying to be aware of the emotions that you are experiencing and not deny them as being, irrelevant or unimportant or damaging. It is simply how you feel. And that acknowledges the fact that awareness of your emotions is also about acknowledging that it might be shaping the way you're seeing the situation. That the way that you see this difficult conversations you're having may be influenced by the way you're feeling about it. It's also important to acknowledge the feelings of the other person during the conversation, particularly social emotions, things like contempt, things like anger. So it's also important to understand that feelings are caused by our thoughts, and that the rational thoughts that sometimes our emotions are caused by irrational thinking. And so it's important to look for things like blame as a clue to whether we're having a feeling that might be rational or irrational. So it's about sort of just trying to be aware of those emotions and acknowledge them within the context of a difficult conversation. So, one of the things that I did when I talked to my business partners, I said, I understand you're upset. He's like, no, it's not about me being upset. I'm like, it is about you being upset, and that's okay. Let's not deny the fact that you're upset and I feel hurt that you made that attribution about my behavior, that you would think that of me. And I'm upset by that. But let's not let that get in the way of us trying to reach a resolution here. Let's focus on what we're trying to do, but let's acknowledge the fact that there are emotions that are happening here, and that's okay, and that's important. Because sometimes difficult conversation is just about getting the emotion out of the way. It's just about, and the thing that we're avoiding when we don't want to have a difficult conversation is we don't want to experience that emotion. We don't want to confront it, and we don't want to confront somebody else's negative emotions. We don't want them to feel angry. We don't want them to feel sad. We don't want them to feel fearful or some other thing. And so we're like, oh, I just don't want to deal with that, right? We don't have a good language to talk about or to deal with it, and so we avoid it. But it turns out acknowledging it can oftentimes simply release it of its power. When we hang on to negative emotions and we deny them, they get manifest as something else. They get manifest as blame. They get manifest as assumption. They get manifest as something that may interfere with your ability to solve that problem. So finally, we have identities, right? So we have facts, we have emotions, and we have identities. Now, identities are a weird one. We have these identities that we're trying to protect, right? So the question really ends up being, what's at stake in this conversation that we're going to have? What's at stake for you? What's at stake for me? And it turns out that there are, 4 but more significant identities that are usually at stake in a difficult conversation. And those identities are really these core identities that each of us have, that each of us are trying to protect. And those identities are really like, I'm a good person. I'm a person who's worthy of love by other people. I'm a person who is competent. And I'm a person who is free to choose and is not being controlled by others, right? And so oftentimes the difficult conversations we have imply a threat to one of these things. A difficult conversation about somebody's, contribution to a team effort may very well be about for them be about whether they're competent or not, right? So when you say, I don't think you're contributing, what they're hearing is, you're not good enough, you're not smart enough to be on this team, you're not somebody who's competent enough to do this, right? And so the conversation is really for them about protecting that identity, not about what happened, what their actual contribution was. So it's recognizing the fact that there are these multiple identities that exist within each of us that we are highly motivated to protect and to defend. And thinking about what's at stake for you and for them is a really important part of thinking about that conversation. In fact, this is where I would start. When I'm thinking about preparing for a difficult conversation, I'd say, what is at stake? What identity is at stake? Because for me, in this conversation I had with my business partner, it was this one. I consider myself to be somebody of high integrity, that's somebody that doesn't have this sort of ego involvement in this business, and that's one of the things I pride about myself. And you're contradicting that identity of myself, this belief that I have about myself, and I've got that's infuriating, right? And so it's important for me to understand, for him to understand that that's not what happened, so that I can, or that's not. It's important for to resolve the conflict, to get through the difficult conversation. It's important that I walk away feeling like I'm okay, right? And it's important for him feeling like he's competent and he's part of the relationship. And so, I realized that, and so I realized that his biggest fear was that he was just not part. He didn't feel like we were, maybe not lovable is too maybe cushy of a word, but that he wasn't part of the team, or he wasn't somebody who was equally respected and part of and so I started the conversation with him, and I said, let's start by thinking about what problems we're trying to solve here. And the first one is what's the nature of our relationship as business partners? And I said, for me, we are equal partners. This is a relationship based on respect, mutual respect, and it's important to me that you understand that that's exactly how I feel. So I took this off the table right off the bat, right? I said, okay, understand that the thing that's driving this for you is an identity threat around relationships. And I want you to understand that that's not the case. And from there, now that you know that's true, what else do we need to work out, right? Then we need to work out why I said what I said and why he reacted the way he did. But once we got that off the table, it was much easier to work through the situation, because we acknowledge the fact, okay, this is what's going on. Because what's at stake is how we feel about ourselves and how we feel about each other. And I'm like, it's important for you to understand why I did this, because that reflects my own identity. So understanding identities is extremely important. Now, how can you so what can you do about trying to think about this? Well, one is to have a growth mindset about your own identities. These identities about being competent and being lovable and being free. It turns out, so when a growth mindset is the belief that you have that things are changeable, that competence is not something you have or don't have. Competence is something that you accrue over time, right? Competence is something that you accrue by getting negative feedback and getting better. Competence is something that you accrue by learning things and doing professional development. Competence is not something that is intrinsic to who you are. And a fixed mindset is the belief that competence is you're either competent or you're not, right? And so if somebody gives you negative feedback or tells you something that suggests you're not competent and you have a fixed mindset about it, that it can't be changed, then that's a huge threat, right? That and getting negative feedback from your boss becomes a very threatening experience because it reflects your deeper identity as being a competent person. But being a competent person, that's not the right idea. That's not the right mindset to have in the first place. Because nobody's a competent person. You have reached a level of competence, right? By the experiences that you've had and the learning that you've done. And if you have a growth mindset about your identities, then you can experience feedback as an opportunity to learn. You can experience a difficult conversation as a way to enhance your identities, rather than as a reflection of how good or bad your identities are. Does that make sense? Got to be aware of the identities of others. You got to understand something about how they see themselves. Because if you don't understand what's at stake for them, you're probably going to be talking about the wrong things in the conversation. You'll be talking about things that don't matter to them. And finally, we want to focus on purpose. What are we trying to achieve here? So when we're trying to understand how to resolve a difficult situation where somebody hasn't lived up to your expectations or you haven't lived up to theirs, the question is always, what is the purpose of this conversation? What is the purpose that we are trying to solve? Is it just for me to reaffirm my own identity? If that's the only purpose, don't have the conversation. The conversation has to be something more than that. It has to be about trying to reach mutual understanding. It has to be about trying to solve the actual problem, trying to reach a sense of agreement for both people. And so thinking about what the purpose is before you walk into a difficult conversation and really trying to say, what are we trying to accomplish here? That's probably the most helpful piece of that, is the most helpful question you can ask yourself before you walk in. So last thing, a couple of preparation questions that I would start, and I guess I start up here. What's the problem if you were going to prepare for a difficult conversation you've got coming up? Some of you might have these coming in the near future. I would say, what's the problem we're trying to solve by having this conversation? What are we trying to accomplish here? What is this conversation going to be about? What's its purpose? Then thinking about, what does success look like for this conversation? So what is the most that can be accomplished, and what is the minimum I need to accomplish? Right? What is the minimum you must accomplish, and what is the maximum you can accomplish in this thing? And it's important to have boundaries around that and understand, what do you need to walk away with, and what is possible to walk away with? What's at stake for both of you? And really, what do I need to learn from them? Not what do I need to tell them, but what do I need to learn from them in the process of this conversation? And I think if you ask yourself these questions before you walk in the door, it will enhance your capability to have a productive outcome. That's it. All right? It's not really a question, sort of. Yes?
I don't believe any of it.
No, it's very interesting.
Yeah.
Adam. My question, you use the example of a business partner. So in terms of power play, you're both at the same level. But for instance, if you're having a conversation about your performance with your manager, power is definitely a complexity there. My performance management, as an example, ended with can agree to disagree, but at the end of the day, it's their voice that counts. So how do you give me your thoughts on how to manage power in these difficult conversations?
Well, I mean, probably one of the worst or one of the most difficult conversations people have is getting feedback, performance feedback that they don't like, right? It's always a difficult conversation. And the first thing I would say is having a growth mindset about competence. So thinking about when you're getting negative feedback, what's at stake for you, right? It might be what's at stake is just your, maybe you're not going to get promoted, or maybe you're not going to, and so there's things at stake, but also your self-perception. Am I a competent person, right? Because if you have this idea about who you are and it's conflicted by performance feedback that suggests that maybe you're not doing your job as well as you could, then that can be quite threatening. And so the question is, how can you take that feedback well, right? How can you say, well, even if the feedback is off, right? Even if they really have no idea what they're talking about, how can you take that information? Because you can't just say, screw you, right? They're your boss. So you still have to listen to you're still in an authoritarian fascist structure. So you still need to listen to what they say. Wow, this really got loud. Super loud. Right, it just said the word. So having a mindset around that feedback that says, okay, what can I learn from that, both about the person that I just spoke to and about myself, right? So competence, so you can say my identity of being a competent person isn't threatened by this. This is just another opportunity for me to gain competence in a number of different ways. One, in terms of understanding the expectations that people have around me, or even just understanding what this person thinks and how they think about the world. And so it's really every opportunity, and even if it's a negative opportunity, is a learning opportunity. But that requires you to have a mindset about yourself as being a flexible position. So, in some ways, there's no easy answer to saying how would you deal with a difficult boss, but trying to have a positive experience from it, right? If it's a difficult conversation from you, success. What's the best you can hope for? Maybe the best you can hope for in that situation is for it to be a positive learning experience for you. So that's one way that I would think about it. The second way I guess I would think about it is to think about how it's still really about identities, but how your understanding of your performance may differ from theirs, right? Because remember, our view of the world and our memory of experiences and what we pay attention to is different. And so, we could say, oh, I did all these things, and I've got all this memory of all this time that I worked really hard, and I've got this very strong, record of things that were important, but they have a different idea about what's important. They paid attention to different pieces of information. And so, negotiating and talking about what it is, how you see the world, and understanding the fact and acknowledging the fact that people see the world quite differently, and two people can have legitimate differences of the way that they view the world, including your own performance. I think that can be helpful in terms of having that conversation, so that we're saying, okay, you see the world, you see the performance like that, and why is that the stuff that you paid attention to? Why are those the things that are highlighted in your mind? Because really, you want to understand, you want to make some attributions or understand where they're coming from and why they see the world the way they do, what they pay attention to. And so the worst case scenario is that you walk away knowing a little bit more about how to manage manage impressions better, at least in the future. So I hope that's helpful. Any other questions? All right. Yes?
So I think it's easier to have difficult conversations. I think if both parties come quite well educated about the biases that I play, but let's say one party is, and the other party is not really, involved in their own emotions and whatnot. It's an unequal sort of.
It is.
And so what do you do? Do you try to suspend the biases? I mean, you've given some really helpful tips there. I guess those would help. But when it's glaringly obvious to one party about all these biases that's being put, not so much to the other person.
Right.
What do you do? Where do you start?
Right. It's true. And I think, I think about that. I talk about this a lot in negotiations, right? Where we think, one of the misconceptions in negotiations is that it's better to negotiate against somebody who's a novice negotiator than an expert negotiator. And it turns out it's actually much better to negotiate against an expert negotiator because they're better at negotiating, they're better at solving problems. And negotiations are just problem-solving opportunities. And if you're talking with somebody else who's bad at solving problems, that they're highly reactive, emotionally reactive, or some other way that's going to make them very difficult to deal with, well, it's sort of up to you to teach them and help them through the process of understanding the situation. So acknowledging biases doesn't just mean acknowledging other people's biases. It means acknowledging your own. Acknowledging that there are differences that we have, it is very possible for us to see the world differently, right? It's not that your way of seeing it, you're like, oh, it's so crystal clear that they are so biased. Of course, they are thinking the same thing about you. And so it is important to acknowledge that there are legitimate differences and where those differences might be coming from. And that those differences can be based on, differences in perception, differences in feelings, different identities that we're trying to protect. And trying to acknowledge those things in a way that acknowledges it for yourself as well as for them. And I think that's a useful way of saying, and that's so in negotiations I often talk about, it's not just about telling the other person what you want and why you want it, but helping the other person to understand what they want, right? What's the purpose? What are you trying to achieve together? And keeping the conversation focused on that and saying, what are the positive outcome we can get from this? What's the purpose of us trying to solve this problem? And yes, you're upset and you see it as being my fault, but what are we trying to achieve here? And so trying to focus on purpose, trying to help acknowledge biases both in yourself and in them can be a useful way of trying to help them through that process. But it's sometimes people just are intractable and they suck and there's nothing you can do. So. I don't want to say every situation is winnable, but that's how I would approach it. All right, cool. Sounds good. Well, enjoy your drinks and awkward conversations.